Breaking tonight, federal agents from the FBI and ICE storm a Somali minister's private compound in a dramatic early morning raid. Federal authorities descend on a Somali minister's compound at dawn, executing a coordinated and explosive raid. Breaking, a high-level Somali minister comes under scrutiny as federal agents storm his private compound at first light. Authorities uncover a massive financial...
Tonight, heavily armed FBI and ICE teams breach a Somali minister's compound as part of a major federal investigation.
It started at 4:12 a.m. That was the first moment the outer security cameras at the minister's private compound caught movement beyond the walls. At first, the guards assumed it was another routine patrol vehicle passing through the quiet road outside. The neighborhood was still dark. The city had not fully woken up. Even the generators inside the compound hummed with the lazy steadiness of an ordinary night. But this was not an ordinary night. By 4:19 a.m., the first black SUV stopped 2 streets away with its lights off. By 4:23 a.m., 2 more vehicles arrived from the opposite side, cutting off the rear access lane that staff cars often use to enter without being seen from the main road. By 4:27 a.m., agents had already taken positions near the perimeter wall. No sirens, no warning, no noise beyond boots on gravel and whispered commands moving through the dark. At 4:31 a.m., the minister's compound was fully surrounded. Inside, most of the household was asleep. A cook had just stepped into the back kitchen to prepare tea for the early shift. 2 guards near the front gate were changing duty. In the east wing, an administrative aide was still awake, reportedly sorting papers from a late-night meeting that had stretched well past midnight. None of them knew that investigators had spent months preparing for this exact hour. At 4:34 a.m., the lead vehicle gave the signal. Within seconds, floodlights hit the outer wall. Agents rushed the front gate while another team breached a service entrance near the staff quarters. Orders rang out in sharp, clipped bursts. Guards were pinned down before they could even coordinate a response. Phones were seized. Entry points were secured. The compound that had seemed untouchable for years was suddenly under complete control. By 4:38 a.m., the raid was official. By 4:41 a.m., agents entered the main residence. By 4:46 a.m., the minister was awake. Witnesses later described confusion first, then panic. Doors opened, lights flashed across marble floors and expensive imported furniture. Staff members stumbled into hallways, half-dressed, trying to understand why so many vehicles had appeared at once. Some believed it was an assassination attempt. Others thought a rival faction had moved against the minister during the night, but this was neither. This was a coordinated federal-style financial crime operation, and the target was not only the man, it was the money, and more like the private headquarters of a hidden financial network. There were folders marked with project names that did not exist on the ground. There were contracts signed by companies with no employees. There were shipment receipts for relief supplies that had never arrived. There were payment authorizations approved in the minister's circle and redirected through layers of intermediaries until the original source of the money almost disappeared. Almost. By 6 a.m., the sun had begun to rise, and outside the walls, rumors were already spreading. Neighbors had seen the vehicles. Drivers on the road had slowed down. Word moved fast through the district. Something major was happening at the minister's compound. By 6:17 a.m., more officials connected to the ministry were being contacted and told not to leave their residences. By 6:32 a.m., financial crime units were cross-checking names found on-site against bank activity flagged during the previous 6 weeks. By 6:48 a.m., at least 3 close aides had been separated for questioning. At 7:05 a.m., the number at the center of the case was repeated again inside the command vehicle parked beyond the gate. $58 million. That was how much foreign aid had vanished. Not over 10 years, not through vague administrative inefficiency, but through a deliberate pattern of diversions, false contracts, phantom projects, and controlled accounts designed to drain public money before it ever reached the people it was meant to help. By 7:20 a.m., agents were carrying boxes out of the compound. By 7:41 a.m., digital evidence teams had isolated communications with offshore entities. By 8 a.m., the first internal briefing described the findings with one sentence. This was organized from the top, and by 8:24 a.m., the story had begun escaping the walls. That was the morning everything changed. But the raid itself was only the final scene of a scandal that had started much earlier, quietly, invisibly, and far from the compound's polished gates. Because for years, the minister had been seen as one of the most internationally connected figures in the country. He knew how to speak to donors. He knew how to present urgency without sounding desperate. He knew how to promise reform while protecting his own circle. On camera, he was measured and confident. He spoke about roads, schools, clean water systems, food assistance, emergency relief corridors, and modernization. He knew the language international agencies wanted to hear: accountability, transparency, community stabilization, institutional trust. He signed agreements. He appeared in photos with envoys. He announced development packages with practice certainty. And for a long time, it worked. Because the most successful corruption does not always look like greed in the beginning. Sometimes it looks like competence. Sometimes it looks like leadership. Sometimes it wears the face of a man who seems exactly like the solution. That was what made this case so dangerous. The money did not vanish in one dramatic theft. It disappeared through a system that had been built carefully, quietly, and with extraordinary discipline. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared during a routine review of donor-funded development disbursements. An audit team noticed minor discrepancies between approved relief allocations and actual field confirmations. At first, the amounts were small enough to be explained away: delivery delays, local accounting issues, administrative mismatches. But the discrepancies kept repeating. A road rehabilitation payment had no completed site. A clinic expansion budget had no clinic. Food relief transfers had no corresponding distribution logs. Water system invoices listed equipment that nobody could physically locate. Then came a more troubling pattern. Many of the same vendor names kept appearing across unrelated projects. Different paperwork, different regions, different humanitarian categories, but the same financial fingerprints buried underneath. The signatures varied slightly, the addresses changed, the registration details shifted from one entity to another, yet when investigators dug deeper, those companies began collapsing into one thing: a web of shell entities controlled through proxies. Some were registered under distant relatives, some under former drivers, assistants, or business associates. Some existed only on paper, others had just enough activity to look real. The structure was clever. Foreign aid entered through official channels, was approved for urgent public use, then rerouted through contracted implementation partners. Those partners subcontracted to smaller firms. Those firms invoiced for work partially completed, never started, or entirely fictional. From there, the money fractured. Small transfers, layered withdrawals, foreign exchange conversions, cross-border holdings. By the time a donor or auditor looked at the surface, the trail had become fog. But not fog thick enough to hide forever. Once investigators began mapping the transfers, one central point kept reappearing: approvals linked to the minister's office. Not his public office alone, his private office, the one inside the compound. That was when suspicion hardened. The compound itself had long been the subject of whispers. It was too secure for a simple residence. Too many vehicles arrived at odd hours. Too many visitors used side entrances. Too many decisions appeared to be made there instead of at the ministry. Senior staff knew important files were sometimes handled off the books in rooms that never appeared in official inventories. Yet no one touched it, because powerful compounds and systems like this are more than homes. They are symbols. They tell everyone around them the same message: this man cannot be challenged. Inside those walls, loyalty was cultivated with gifts, access, fear, and dependency. Guards were paid to stay silent. Drivers were paid to forget routes. Clerks were paid to stamp papers they never read. Contractors were paid to appear legitimate, and the minister's inner circle benefited enough to protect the machine. The investigators would later describe the structure not as chaotic corruption, but as disciplined extraction. Foreign aid money came in carrying hope. By the time it left, it carried private profit. The hardest part for the public to understand was how brazen the operation had become. The projects tied to the missing $58 million were not obscure. Many had been publicly praised. Some had been announced with speeches and banners. Communities had been told help was coming. Officials had stood in front of cameras promising transformation. Expectations had been raised in areas where people desperately needed relief. But on the ground, many of those promises existed only as paper. A school budget, no school. A supply chain, no supplies. A water corridor, no water. A district health program, no medicine. And that was the true cruelty of the scandal. This was not just about numbers missing from ledgers. It was about people waiting for aid that never arrived, families waiting for food shipments delayed by lies, villages hearing that millions had been allocated in their name while they saw nothing but dust, shortages, and broken assurances. Every stolen dollar had a human shadow attached to it. As the investigation expanded, the minister's public image began to crack. Officials who had once praised him became cautious in their statements. Donor representatives demanded urgent explanations. Internal ministry staff suddenly remembered details they had previously been too afraid to mention. Former associates became difficult to reach. Some deleted accounts, some withdrew cash, some tried to leave the country. That only made the investigators move faster. They traced property purchases linked to proxies. They flagged luxury imports inconsistent with official salaries. They uncovered private holdings under names that connected back to the same network of shell companies, high-end vehicles, land purchases, foreign accounts, renovations paid through development subcontractors. And buried inside financial logs recovered from the compound, they found what may have been the network's greatest mistake. Discipline turned into arrogance. Someone had kept records, detailed ones. Not because they expected to be caught, but because operations of this size require control. Someone had tracked inflows, outflows, who received what, which project covered which transfer, which account moved money temporarily before it jumped elsewhere. There were codes, yes, there were aliases, but there was also a logic to the system. Enough logic for investigators to begin rebuilding the whole map. The minister, according to early accounts, said very little during the raid. He was reportedly shown authorizations, transfer paths, and company registrations tied to names inside his circle. He denied personal involvement at first, then he shifted to procedural ambiguity, then he said almost nothing. Silence in cases like this is never empty. Sometimes it means calculation, sometimes it means fear, sometimes it means the man at the center knows the problem is no longer what can be denied, but what others might say next, and others were already starting to talk. One detained finance coordinator reportedly admitted that several emergency aid projects were designed from the beginning as cover channels. Another aide described late-night review sessions inside the compound where figures were adjusted before being passed to ministries and donors. A procurement-linked associate revealed that some contracts were deliberately split across multiple entities to avoid detection triggers. Each statement widened the scandal. Each detail made it harder to contain. The case was no longer just about one minister pocketing money. It was about a corruption architecture built around aid itself. An architecture that may have involved bankers, contractors, document handlers, intermediaries, and officials who never touched the cash directly, but helped keep the illusion alive. That is why the raid sent shockwaves far beyond the compound. Because once such a system is exposed, every project tied to it becomes suspect. Every approval is questioned. Every smiling photograph with a donor becomes uncomfortable evidence of how appearances were weaponized. By midday, the political fallout had already begun. Rival figures called for accountability. Public outrage surged. International partners quietly reviewed active funding. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors. Some officials tried to frame the scandal as an isolated betrayal by one man, but investigators were not treating it that way. They knew operations involving $58 million do not survive on one signature alone. Too many people must approve. Too many people must process. Too many people must look away. And that is why the most dangerous phase of the case was still ahead. The raid had uncovered evidence. The next step would uncover relationships. Who else signed the paperwork? Who arranged the foreign transfers? Who registered the shell entities? Who protected the minister from scrutiny? Who inside the aid chain ignored warnings because the minister was politically valuable? Those questions mattered because corruption at this level is rarely a single act. It is a culture of permission, a network of mutual benefit, a silent agreement that as long as the money keeps moving, no one asks what happens between the announcement and the outcome. But now everyone was asking, and the compound that once represented power had become something else entirely. A crime scene, a monument to excess, a symbol of what happens when public trust is converted into private wealth behind walls, guards, and carefully polished speeches. For ordinary people, the betrayal cut deepest where the promises had been loudest. Foreign aid is not abstract to communities living with shortages. It means grain deliveries, medical access, repaired roads, functioning wells, transport corridors, school materials, emergency support. It means survival, stability, and a chance to believe someone somewhere is still working in the public interest. To discover that tens of millions had vanished through staged contracts and fake implementation chains was more than a scandal. It was an insult, the kind that lingers long after arrests are announced. Because stolen aid damages more than budgets, it destroys faith. And when faith is destroyed, even honest future efforts become harder. People stop believing announcements. They stop trusting institutions. They assume every new promise is another performance. Corruption does not only steal money, it poisons the idea that government can still do good. That may be the biggest consequence of all. As night fell on the same day as the raid, boxes of evidence were still being cataloged, devices were being decrypted, banking requests were being sent across borders, names were being matched to transactions. The compound itself remained under security, no longer a fortress but a frozen snapshot of a collapsing network. And somewhere inside all those files, investigators believed, was the answer to the final question. Was the minister the architect? Or only the most visible face of something even larger? Because scandals like this rarely end where they begin. They spread, from one office to another, from one signature to the next, from one stolen project to an entire ecosystem of fraud. That is why the morning timeline matters. Because at 4:12 a.m., the compound was still a place of power. By 8:24 a.m., it was a national scandal. And by the end of that day, one truth had become impossible to hide. $58 million in foreign aid had not vanished by accident. It had been taken, moved, protected, hidden overnight behind prestige, paperwork, and fear. Now the walls had been breached. The records were in government hands. The aides were under questioning. The donors were demanding answers. And the man who once stood before cameras as a trusted minister was now at the center of one of the most devastating aid corruption cases the country had ever seen. The raid was the first blow. The investigation would decide how many more names fell after it. And for everyone watching, the same question remained hanging over the story like smoke after the breach. How deep does it go?